Thank you, Judy. Welcome everyone to our November lecture on the fascinating topic of synchronicity. A warm welcome back to our guest speakers today, Gary Bobroff, author and founder of 2 Jungian websites, and Dr. Cynthia Cavalli, physicist, life coach, and executive leadership consultant. Jung's recognition of synchronicity as an acausal but meaningful event in our lives can draw us toward a healing experience with the numinous. They will invite us to sit with and explore such experiences, observing both our thinking and feeling reception of them, and how our over-rational egos may question the validity of such experiences. Their capacity for healing is recognized by alchemists, Taoists, and many indigenous cultures today. Gary S. Bobroff holds a master's degree in Jungian-oriented counseling psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. He speaks and gives seminars internationally. He's the author of a book called Knowledge in a Nutshell, Carl Jung, and the founder of Jungian Online, a website that links clients with Jungian analysts and psychotherapists. His other website, Jung Arch Academy, offers lectures and events for the public by authors and psychotherapists. Dr. Cynthia Cavalli is an executive leadership coach and organizational consultant. She holds degrees in physics, business administration, and human systems. She worked for 30 years in the aerospace field. Cynthia offers seminars and workshops, weaving together her knowledge of science and ancient wisdom traditions. So on the topic of synchronicity and the goddess of meaning, welcome, Gary and Cynthia.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, Judy. Cynthia, do you want to say a couple words before I get going?
I'll just say thank you, Virginia and Judy, for that warm welcome. I am a longtime member of the Orange County Jung Club, so it's a real pleasure to be seeing all of you again. I've missed you, and it's a great to be back and presenting again. Thank you so much for the chance.
Yeah, I echo that. I encourage people to join the Orange County Jung Club, and I've been there several times over the years and always had a really good time, and it's wonderful what they're doing online now. And so I encourage you to join them, and it's great to see some of you again and see many friends in the audience as well. So thanks for joining us. All right. So I'm going to get you going with the presentation here. Just going to do a few slides, and then Cynthia is going to take over from there. So we are going to do a more in-depth course here with Cynthia and I for 7 weeks, starting in February on the Jung Academy, JUNGARCHADEMY, Jung Academy. You can find it there. And we're going to go more in-depth into this material that we've been working with for many years, and it's really, as you'll see today, very important to us. So the term synchronicity, of course, is coined by Jung, and luckily he had people like Einstein.
Happened. There we go. Back on.
Okay. All right. Okay. So as I said, Jung coined the term synchronicity, and he was lucky to have people like Einstein and Wolfgang Pauli around to help him sort out this mysterious phenomenon that he was encountering in his life and in the lives of his patients, and as he found reflected in the Chinese world and The Secret of the Golden Flower, and in the Tao and in the I Ching. And you can see the whole history of his engagement with it there and his writings on it. Here's one definition: synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence or equivalence of a psychic and a physical state or event which have no causal relationship to one another. Such synchronistic phenomenon occur, for instance, when an inwardly perceived event is seen to have a correspondence in external reality. The inner image of a premonition has come true, for example. Of similar or identical thought streams, etc., occurring at the same time in different places, neither the one nor the other coincidence can be explained by causality, but seems to be connected primarily with activated archetypal processes in the unconscious. This is a diagram that's important, and we're going to return to it later. And I think, the key for you to take away here is that synchronicity seems to operate, or does visibly, objectively operate outside of the realm of time and space. So the rules of time and space do not apply in synchronicities, and we'll talk about that more. Basic definition here: a meaningful correlation of outer events and inner states across space and time. I'm going to show you a few different examples throughout today, but we're going to start with this one. So this is from Norman Mailer's own account of working on Barbary Shore, a novel. He says, working on Barbary Shore, I always felt as if I were not writing the book myself, but rather as if I were serving as a subject for some intelligence which had decided to use me to write the book. It had nothing to do with whether the work was good or bad. It just had to do with the fact that I had absolutely no conscious control of it. If I hadn't heard about the unconscious, I would have had to postulate one to explain this phenomenon. The first time I became powerfully aware of the fact that I had an unconscious, which seemed to have little to do with me. The book came out sentence by sentence. I literally never knew where the day's work was coming from. Ironically, writing about FBI agents and old Bolsheviks in Barbary Shore, the greatest single difficulty was the book was that my common sense thought it was impossible to have all these agents and impossible heroes congregating in a rooming house in Brooklyn. Yet a couple of years later, I was working in a studio on Fulton Street at the end of Brooklyn Heights. On the floor below me worked one Colonel Rudolph Abel, who was the most important spy for the Russians in this country for a period of about 8 or 10 years. And I'm sure that we used to be in the elevator together many times. I think he literally had the room beneath me. I've always been overcome with that. It made me decide that there's no clear boundary between experience and imagination. Who knows what glimpses of reality we pick up unconsciously, telepathically. So there you see the psyche operating as a field, not as something up in his head, but as a field phenomenon that sort of infected him from below and gave birth to this book. And we're going to continue to come back to that, and I'm going to invite Cynthia now to take over.
Thanks, Gary. All right, let me share my screen here. I'm going to go into presentation mode. And how's that? Everybody can see? Okay, thanks,
Yeah.
Virginia.
Yeah.
All right. So what I love about the Barbary Coast story is that it really makes you wonder about the mystery of what is going on and how interconnected we are. And if we're so interconnected, why is it only sometimes apparent? Why isn't always there? And I think that's a question that skeptics often raise because, it seems selective and it seems to depend on the person so much. So what's going on there? And we'll talk a little bit about that later. I'd like to share a little background on how I became interested in this subject. And my goal is to offer some description of the feminine order and structure of synchronicity, looking at synchronicity from the perspective of feminine order and structure. So I'll clarify some of the distinctions between feminine and masculine approaches. And I'm guessing with an audience like this that you're very familiar, but it's helpful to level set the terminology. So I was newly laid off from aerospace and working on my dissertation. And an analyst friend asked what my research was going to cover. And at that time, I wasn't yet sure. I hadn't decided, but I was interested in synchronicity. And separately, I was really interested in complexity. And I mentioned those things. And he said, oh, do you know that Joe Cambry is working on the intersection of these two phenomena? And I was really blown away. And I have to tell you, from that point on, I was in a deep love affair with this material. I couldn't wait to daydream about it, to ponder. You know, it had so many mysteries. I just really loved this intersection. And I mean, it really changed the trajectory of my life ultimately. But during this time, as in love as I was with the material, I kept coming across certain criticisms of Jung's framework. Criticism saying it was overly complicated because it was utilizing a scientific perspective. So people who were from the corner of reality, or maybe religious people or spiritual people who came from the unus mundus world, were like, you know, you're overcomplicating it. Of course, what Jung was doing was introducing the subject of synchronicity into the scientific world. He was bringing it into scientific discourse. And for that, I'm immensely grateful. So I come from the scientific world, so I didn't really understand why the criticism, right? But anyway, over the years, it's now been many years since that happened. And the implications of synchronicity for the nature of reality has begun, you know, it has had time to sink into all the different layers of my psyche. And the role of feeling and value began to take on greater import and greater prominence in my experience of synchronicity. And it's as if this whole other aspect of reality began to stir and awaken. And what was that all about? What was going on? That's what I want to highlight. That's one aspect I want to highlight in this talk today. I do have a quote here. This is a really rough quote, and I've debated whether to share it or not. I think it explains why we have such a masculine bias, why we have such a bias against nature. He was saying, and this is a quote is excerpted from a book by Bruce Moran, The Technology of Knowing. In order to learn any of the secrets of nature, one had to be aggressive, put nature on the rack, and wring the truth out of her. Real learning occurred not when nature was free, but when it was under constraint and vexed, when by the hand of man, she's forced out of her natural state and squeezed and molded. You can begin to see how this current modern attitude towards nature and towards the feminine, and again, you know, against the embrace of rational thought over more feminine modes of thought might have come to be. So according to Jung, there are two ways that reality is ordered. You have the causal phenomena, which is recognized in the West. You have acausal phenomena, which is recognized more in the East. Causal phenomena is time-bound material physicality. Acausal is atemporal, and it's detectable by pattern matching equivalences. And the acausal phenomena fall across a spectrum of meaning, you could say, with natural numbers and radioactive decay at one end. They don't have particular meaning. They just are the way they are. At the other end, you can have very meaningful synchronicities and meaningful coincidences. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on these two different kinds of order. Today is about exploring feminine structure. So we'll save that discussion for another time. But for now, I want you to allow yourself to sink into how these two different ways of experiencing reality feel. And I'd like to try to create a bridge between Jung's conceptual framework of synchronicity and a more feminine experience of these same. And we'll move away from Bacon's way of thinking about it. Now, what I learned about this feeling place, this feeling approach, is that it's a real place. It's not simply something that we imagine. It's a place. It has its own logic. It has its own laws of nature. It even has its own flora and fauna, if you will. And I'm pretty certain all of you have some, if not a lot of experience of this place, even if you may not have articulated it for yourselves. It's also a place, it's an ongoing learning experience for me. Now, this is a picture of, it's an alchemical picture, and it depicts, I think the way that Western alchemists saw their relationship with nature as an elusive, beautiful woman whom they followed, blindly groping for the path in their effort to explore her mysteries. And the great thing about alchemy is because it is, maybe you could call it a proto-science, it involves the use of the whole being, consciousness and also the unconscious. And in particular, it uses imagination. So it has a compensatory aspect, which comes through in the images, which kind of offsets the modern cultural lopsidedness towards masculine only. But even though I'm from this culture and I possess masculine qualities and masculine worldview, as a woman, this image depicts what feels like a decidedly masculine perspective. So that isn't it doesn't depict my relationship to nature. I don't see it that way. Anyway, this image offers another step in this bridge, highlighting the masculine perspective in contrast with the more feminine perspective. Now, this is a picture. Gary actually put this together, and it's starling murmuration. And I think all of you have seen these images before. Whoops. This to me depicts the essence of this feminine perspective on structure and order. This is feminine structure and order in action. And I like the way it feels. I like the way it moves. Who's in charge there? Nobody. Nobody's in charge. Everybody's moving together. So I'm trying to read this quote, but as soon as I pull away to the quote, it stops the video. I don't think it's moving anymore. But anyway, this is what it feels like to me. I think Hippocrates' quote is maybe the best at capturing how this feeling is. There is one common flow, one common breathing. All things are in sympathy. The whole organism and each one of its parts are working in conjunction for the same purpose. The great principle extends to the extremist part, and from the extremist part, it returns to the great principle, to the one nature, being and not being. And this clip captures that idea for me. So let's go to the next slide. All right, synchronicity in the feminine. Before I go further, my husband found this slide and I really liked it. It's a quote by Starhawk, and it just kind of clarifies the difference. The symbolism of the goddess is not a parallel structure to the symbolism of God the Father. The goddess does not rule the world. She is the world, manifest in each of us. She can be known internally by every individual in all her magnificent diversity. So there's a tendency to think of God the Father and the goddess as a kind of a two sides of the same coin, which is not quite accurate. That's not how we're using it. And there may be times when you want to look at the parity there between the two, but that's not what we're doing today. All right, so let's see. Okay, so let's talk about some of the distinctions between masculine and feminine. You can see here, I've delineated them a little bit. You can see cause and effect, the direct connection, as opposed to the Tao. You can have Chronos, a way of accounting for time, and Kairos. Chronos is more linear and direct. Kairos is more cyclical. Or actually, Kairos is about the meaningful moment, the moment in time. You have cognitive and rational versus relational. and feeling, and non-rational, linear, ascending, circular, spiral, quantifiable, qualitative. And there's a story that von Franz tells in her book on synchronicity and divination that I think illustrates this quantifiable versus qualitative. And she's actually quoting somebody, and I don't remember who the quote's from. She tells a story in an older time in China, pre-communist China. There are 11 generals deciding to attack or retreat, and they took a vote. 3 voted to attack, 8 voted to retreat. So they chose to attack because the number 3 stands for unanimity. So that is an example of a qualitative use of number as opposed to the quantitative way we're used to doing it. I mean, imagine how that would work with our elections. I don't know how that would work, but it makes the point. There are different ways of using number. Now, can we consider both masculine and feminine perspectives at the same time? Of course, that would provide a more holistic evaluation of any situation. But the bias of our culture has been to focus on the masculine at the exclusion of the feminine. And so, some of what we're showing might make it look like masculine is bad and feminine is good. It's not. That's not the point at all. But only focusing on the masculine to the exclusion of the feminine, that's where you get into trouble. You want both. You don't want to focus on the feminine at the exclusion of the masculine either, but our culture doesn't seem to be in danger of doing that. Now, I like this. These are more delineations, and I like these spirit and soul in dynamic tension. That's what these describe. I like these. These are from Patrick Harper. It's from his book, The Secret Tradition of the Soul. And I'll just read a few excerpts from his book. This is where it makes it sound like spirit is maybe negative. Spirit flies. Can you hear me okay? Spirit flies and soars and longs for transcendence, to rise above the world. Spirit is a Puritan, like the ascetic monk, or the purist scientist, turning his back on soul's messy illogic. Soul favors the circuitous route, the underworld. She's suspicious of purity, knowing reality is complex and muddy. Spirit resents the way soul is always trying to hold him down or entangle him, just as he leaps out of bed to embark on a new adventure. His important work is interrupted by soul's stomach rumblings and daydreams. Her fits of giggles break in on his high-minded, solemn meditations. Spirit strives to bring soul to heal and control her desires. But the more puritanically he denies those daimons, the more strongly they return. Spirit is humorless, and soul adores every kind of joke. Spirit prefers hard facts. If a thing isn't literal, it's not real. Soul says the basis of all reality is image, myth, story. In short, imagination. Spirit wants to commandeer soul for his own purposes, progress, growth, improvement. He turns soul's playful self-sufficiency into practical self-help. Meanwhile, Plotinus wrote, "Let every soul recall then, at the outset, the truth that soul is the author of all living things, that it had breathed the life into them all. Whatever is nourished by earth and sea, all the creatures of the air, the divine stars in the sky." So to spiritual hierarchical thinking, the daimons are at best the missing links between this world and the world above. But to soul, they are the very fabric of a single world that shifts shape according to whatever perspective, whatever God we are looking through. A wholesome life, then, is made out of holding spirit and soul together in tandem and in tension. This means balancing the one and the many. So I love these distinctions. They remind me to balance my perspective. They give me permission to relinquish control sometimes, allowing me to refrain from like this collective addiction to perfection that exists. Not that I am nearly perfect, but it allows me to relax a little bit, not to be always completely put together. I really struggled to find how to describe this. The non-structural structure of feminine order. Here are some descriptions, some descriptive terms. The sympathy of all things. Now, I already showed that quote by Hippocrates, but there is a sympathy, this idea of the sympathy of all things coming together. The Tao, where you have meaningful connections, things that like to happen together. The Tao never does. These are quotes from the Tao Te Ching. The Tao never does, yet through it, all things are done. So a kind of the non-doing. The state in which ego and non-ego are no longer opposed is called the pivot of Tao. Tao is obscured when you fix your eye on little segments of existence only. Heaven's net is wide, coarse are the meshes, yet nothing slips through. So you get this feeling of a non-doing way that everything gets done, where maybe you have a larger intention set or a larger goal, and you participate. It's a dialogue with nature and with Psyche, and somehow things come together. It reminds me of Psyche's tasks, when she is, when she has to separate like the grains of, pepper from something else, from grains, or the Baba Yaga gives the task to Vasilisa, and she has to separate the mildewed corn from the good corn. And it's an impossible task. And so she goes to sleep, and the little creatures of the night come and they do it for her. And it's done. It's magical. And that's what this that's what this makes me feel. That's what this reminds me of. So my husband actually found this picture, and I love it because I'm going to tell you a little story about my own experience of the goddess of meaning, how we came up with this this idea. The idea of the goddess of meaning came while I was wrestling with my data analysis and the research I was doing on synchronicity. I had all of these first-person accounts of my participants' life-altering synchronicity experiences. They were all so individual and different, and I was just struggling to identify common themes or anything resembling a scientific conclusion. I found that my cognitive mind was kind of useless. It was no help at all, and it was even a hindrance. In desperation, I sat night after night, long past midnight. I was doodling, diagramming, excuse me, trying to figure out what are the themes here? What is this saying about reality? What is this saying about synchronicity? We had a sweet neighborhood cat who had adopted us. He would show up at the back door after midnight. That's where my office was back then. He'd come in, have a snack, settle himself on the arm of the sofa next to my laptop. He would lay a comforting paw on my arm. He would doze off while I sat and waited for inspiration. My husband was fast asleep. The neighborhood was fast asleep and quiet. Time seemed to stand still. And in that stillness, I began to realize it wasn't empty. The night wasn't empty. It was full of all of these beings. And as the night wore on, I fell into deeper and deeper realms, into a kind of a reverie. And I found that I could regulate where I went, these deeper realms, using the cadence of my breath. Now, I'm guessing many of you may be proficient at breath work or meditation, but I was not. And this happened to me quite naively. And somewhere in the depths of this undirected reverie, there was somebody there. There was a distinct presence. I became so excited, it brought me right out of the reverie, right? And then I tried to meet her again. I tried to go to that place. she just didn't conform to my idea of regular times or a schedule. Not that I'm terribly scheduled, but she really did not conform to anything I could imagine. I certainly couldn't command her to appear. I just had to wait for her. I couldn't have an agenda about it. I couldn't have a purpose. I had to just wait, and she appeared when she did. And then I began to dream about her, and slowly, through images, I began to put together this idea that she was associated with this aspect of this aspect of meaning that Jung was talking about. That was the essence of synchronicity, this element of objective meaning in nature, and that she represented this deep interconnectedness that Jung identified as objective meaning. And so I began to call her the goddess of meaning, because in dreams, that's how she appeared. And I'll say this, that's how she appeared to me. And then in a footnote of the book that Jung co-authored with Cavalli titled The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, excuse me, Jung mentions his own encounter with what he describes as a god of meaning. So, it felt like I wasn't completely crazy. And I have to point out, I'm not special. Even though it's true that we're all unique individuals, we each have our own unique experiences and have our own relationship with this quality of objective meaning. This is how it manifested for me. It was a personification that was helpful to me. And I can't go around talking about it because it makes me sound crazy and inflated and precious, But the truth is, it is possible for each person to develop your own relationship to this dimension of reality. And I really encourage it because it offers a tremendous antidote, a feminine antidote, a counterpoint to the lopsided emphasis on masculine perspectives that our culture employs. So these next slides kind of illustrate when we were talking, right after Gary shared that Barbary Coast example, I was talking about, well, how come it happens sometimes and not all the time? And that's a common criticism. So here you can see I'm using this image of like this kind of rhizome structure of trees and underground network here. And I'm going to use brain waves to help us talk about it, or just to illustrate the point. At beta waves, you have normal waking consciousness, which I would place like over here above ground where the trees are. And look you see this tree over here, you see that tree over here, and they look like separate trees. Maybe they're related because they're kind of near each other, but maybe they're not. You wouldn't necessarily think that they were. We look at each other, we think, oh, you're a person over there, and then there's a dog over there, or a cat over there, and there's somebody else over there. We all look like separate beings. When you get to the alpha state waves, now consciousness is reduced, awareness is expanded. I would put that kind of down here at ground level, maybe. Learning, visualization, and concentration are heightened. Now let's look at theta waves. Okay, now you're starting to go below the ground a little bit here. This is the realm of REM sleep, vivid dreams, insight. This is a highly creative zone. Okay. Now even deeper, delta waves, deep dreamless sleep, deep relaxation. I would say you're down here, probably. Now, at this point, you're probably not even aware of your body, right? Now, above beta, you have gamma waves, and then below delta, you have epsilon. And these are areas where at the gamma, you have hyperconcentration, mystical experiences. So maybe that's way up here. Epsilon, deep meditation, spiritual insights, mystical experiences. Again, it's probably way down here, way in the deeper layers of the collective psyche. I like to use this as a metaphor to understand if you're in these deep space, each of these layers has it's like a different realm. It's a different realm of nature. It's peopled by different kinds of beings. the rules of engagement are different. It's almost like you have a different code of behavior and different rules of laws of nature that preside over that dimension. So you can do things in dreams that you wouldn't do in waking life. That's because you're up here. Now, the way you're connected to people is different down here than it is out here. Out here, you can pretend you're all separate, but the truth is, this is the truth. We're all connected down here. I have another. Okay, so this is a picture of holotropic breath work. And I'm not a practitioner. That's Stan Groff and I think his former wife developed it. But I have studied shamanic dreaming, and you can use breath work to enter altered states, of course. Everybody knows that. But what, in my naive way, what I found is I could alter the cadence of my breath, and I would find myself at a different place in my reverie. And each of those were like, it was like portals to other dimensions. So I'm using this just as a illustration to represent that. So you have spiritual experience, blissful state, insightfulness. I mean, there were different beings at these different places. It was really remarkable. We don't spend a lot of time here, and maybe that's not a bad thing, because you might be considered crazy at that point. You know, there's always that danger. You have to get along in the world somehow, but it shouldn't be at the expense of this world, I think. And how you manage to do that is going to be a different answer for everybody. It's not straightforward, but it's really worthwhile figuring out. Okay, so now this is the picture of a muntjac deer. And the way that I described my experience of the goddess of meaning and meeting her, this is the experience of a scientist who, his name is Dr. Stephen Harding, and he describes how he studied when he was working on his doctorate. He studied this deer, and the way he describes it is exactly how I describe my experience of the goddess of meaning. And I suspect it's, well, anyway, I'll come to that. This is really a conversation about the experience of encountering the numinous. So Dr. Stephen Harding, he's a coordinator of the Master's in Science program in Holistic Science at Schumacher College. He's the author of Animate Earth, Science, Intuition, and Gaia. And he says, encountering means meeting something in a way that goes beyond one's intellectual process. When your conceptual structure vanishes and you actually meet the being as the being, coming forth from itself as itself, revealing itself to you in a way that's beyond your intellect, in a way that's much more deeply intuitive and much harder to express. In fact, scientific language is inappropriate for this kind of encounter. It's poetry that does it. So I'll share this. Here's what he said. It's a poetic encounter. I had many experiences of this kind of encounter with the muntjac deer. And some of the moments I most remember would be when I was just waiting. And for many minutes, even an hour or more, nothing would happen. And then if I was lucky, a muntjac would appear and just stand, even for just a few seconds. And if I was lucky, would look in my direction. And then time stood still, time stopped. There was this infinite moment of meeting between myself and the deer. There was a sense of the being of the deer as a revelation, as a kind of syrupy smoke moving from the deer to me, infusing my whole being with muntjacness. So I could immediately understand the wholeness of the deer and who the muntjac were as an animal with their own ecological niche in the forest. And it went further than that. I could also get a sense of the ecology of the whole forest. So this is actually the way to connect deeply with anything in the world. This is, I believe, how you start learning to communicate with animals. I'm just fascinated by animal communicators and the way that they're able to get very deep and communicate real messages. They're really communicating. I mean, now they have all these talking buttons, and animals learn how to communicate with us, which is great because we're not as good at it as they are. But you can use this kind of process. I'm part of several kind of online organizations where they teach you this, and it's fascinating. I think this is also how people who are mediums talk about how they start out, how to connect with other dimensions of reality. So it's an approach available to all of us. Different people, you need to be aware of your own appetite for this, because sometimes you don't want to spend all your time there. It can be seductive, maybe. I guess that would be a word. So just keep that in mind, where you feel comfortable, how it works for your life. But these are tools of feminine relationship working with reality. So 2 important tools of approaching the feminine: imagination and feeling, valuing. When it comes to imagination, I want you to think about this, because when we use our imagination, I think we thrive. We do great. Everything has an opportunity. The problem is that there's something that steals our imagination in every day. I think you can think, I have there, war is a failure of imagination. Haste. I remember visiting my parents, and there's always something to do. And so I had made one day, the last day, a day to just sit and relax and be with them. And instead, something happened, and suddenly it was all hands on deck, and everybody drop everything and come and deal with this emergency. And of course, emergency happens, but they can, if you let them, steal your imagination. They can steal your feeling of peace if you allow it. It's tricky. I don't know always how to not let it happen. Just a basic rejection of the irrational, or an over-attention to what's rational, to masculine structure, so that you're so embedded in it, to habit and routine, that you never allow yourself to go outside of what you know or where you know. These are just essential tools for psyche, for living by a synchronicity, and to kind of help you get a better feel for it. Let me see if I had more. I guess a question to ask yourselves is, what other tools do we allow ourselves to be robbed of? These qualities of goddess, the feeling nature of the feminine, these all tend to be attacked and denigrated or dismissed in our culture, that I would say it's as unconsciously masculine and spirit motivated and patriarchal as ours is. And these are the qualities of being that become routinely denied. They're also essential for navigating reality and recognizing this quality of objective meaning that threads through nature and through which our world is deeply interconnected. I think this is what can serve as a powerful antidote to the over-masculinization of our culture. That's all I have right now, Gary. I have another slide that can go to the later on.
Yeah.
Let me stop sharing here. You want to pick up from here?
Sure. That was wonderful. Thank you. And I hope folks will see that what I'm sharing is a parallel to what Cynthia was sharing. That it's a complement and with a slightly different emphasis, which is what I love about our work together. We're really at the same endpoint, but we have different backgrounds and interests, and we can blend these 2 different points of view really nicely. So I'm going to take you through a bunch of material, and we're going to end up in a very similar place to where you just ended up. So as I said before, it's important to understand psyche is a field. Psyche is not just something in your brain. And in the beautiful image that Cynthia shared of the starling murmuration, you can see these birds moving in a way. And if you look, there are scientific studies of starlings and other and fish that school in those ways. those movements are too fast to be physically coordinated by their brains. What you're looking at there are field phenomenons, which is exactly what they look like. Again, Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is the real one. They look exactly like a field, and that's exactly what they are. There's a shared field psyche happening with these animals. For those of you that are interested in the extended mind and the extension of consciousness, I want to encourage you to check out the work of Rupert Sheldrake. There are studies that have been done in Holland and in other places that look at the sense of being stared at, and they've run these experiments tens of thousands of times. And what they find out is that there's about a 55% chance that people can understand themselves or can feel when they are being stared at, and that is statistically off the chart significant. And you can read about this kind of work and more in Rupert's books, and I really encourage you to check them out. The middle one, The Sense of Being Stared At, is basically looking at all of the science on the extension of consciousness that's been done and putting it together. And if you read that Sense of Being Stared At, you're really going to know what you're talking about in terms of the extension of consciousness. Jung tells us that feeling is psychic mass, and it plays a very important role in these phenomenon, and it is one that our masculine bias constantly has us missing. Here's what Jung says in Aeon. Phenomenon cannot be grasped in its totality by the intellect, for it consists not only of meaning, but also of value, and this depends on the intensity of the accompanying feeling tones. The feeling value is a very important criterion which psychology cannot do it without, because it determines in large measure the role that the content will play in the psychic economy. The affective value gives the measure of the intensity of an idea, and the intensity in turn expresses that idea's energetic tension and its affective potential. So feeling is a measurement of psychic mass. It tells us how important something is to it, and also its potential in the world to have things like this happen. So feeling, for example, plays a role in telepathy and card guessing. In the experiments of the sense of being stared at, or in card guessing, who does best at it? People who know each other better do better at it. People that are related do even better than that. And who does the best at card guessing? Twins. Quite like we might intuitively expect, there is a shared field in people that are close to each other to some extent. You also see the same thing in people sharing a bed, having the same dream is a very common version of that. Jung talks about beginner's luck and the fact that there does seem to be something for it. And what's going on there is that novelty of feeling. Rhime's already shown that the test person's lively interest is of paramount importance. When it slackens by the test person getting accustomed to the results quickly deteriorate. A certain affective condition seems to be indispensable. One therefore has to look at emotional conditions. So beginner's luck, it's the feeling, the novelty of the newness that makes that a real phenomenon. And Rupert does look at that in the sense of being stared at. This is from Albertus Magnus, who was a teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas. He writes, a certain power to alter things indwells in the human soul and subordinates the other things to her, particularly when she is swept into great excesses of love or hate or the like. For a long time, I did not believe it, but I found that the emotionality of the human soul is the chief cause of all these things. So what does that mean in reality? If you've had experiences of after a breakup, you run into this person all over town. We're going to talk about some synchronicity examples a little bit later, but feeling plays a role in synchronicity that folks in our culture so often miss. Jung says synchronistic phenomena occur for the most part in emotional situations. For instance, in cases of death, sickness, accident, and so on. We observe them relatively frequently at moments of heightened emotional activation. which need not, however, be conscious. And of course, Jung had a tremendous number of these himself, including, his famous argument with Freud and the scarab-beetle synchronicity, which many of you know. So it is a very common phenomenon for example, you might see on Oprah the mom who knows across the world her daughter or son is in danger on a sailing expedition around the world. Psyche transcends time and space. And we talk about the extended mind, but it's really the extended heart. It's our feeling connection to others that carries across time and space. Elsa Benitez, a model and television host in Mexico, she says, I was booked aboard TW Flight 800 that exploded over the Atlantic soon after takeoff. She was crying on the phone to her husband and said, I feel something is going to happen on the flight. Her husband told her not to worry, but she continued to cry. She changed her flight and took off 10 minutes after Flight 800. It made me appreciate so much that being alive is a gift. And these kind of feeling indicators or dreams or other things before tragic events is a common human experience. Jung has a great story that I heard Richard Tarnas tell at the Synchronicity Symposium in 2014 that many of you are with me at, where he was having an issue with a watch that had just been to the Swiss watch fixer, and in the midst of discussing a paper, he realized that his watch no longer working signaled him to remember that, or to understand that he was the one not getting it in this discussion. And this is at age 75. Jung is willing to take a synchronicity of his watch not working, which was just at the watchmaker, and go, I'm the one not getting this discussion. And it turned his mind towards publishing a paper that previously he was not going to publish. So there are these synchronicities that are not about our ego fulfillment. Very often people's first reaction to a synchronicity is wanting it to be what you want it to be. Very often synchronicities, as Jung was showing us there, are the exact opposite of that. They're about the opposite of ego fulfillment very often. They're about us discovering something we're resisting. We showed the diagram earlier of synchronicity in the space-time continuum. Synchronicity is outside of those laws of time and space, but somehow feeling continues to matter here. And we don't understand what psyche is, and that's a very important admission that we need to make in our culture. And Jung talks about the East understanding it much more the way that we're talking about here. The East based much of its science on this irregularity and considers coincidences as the reliable basis of the world rather than causality. Synchronism is the prejudice of the East. Causality is the modern prejudice of the West. The more we busy ourselves with dreams, the more we shall see such coincidences, chances. Remember that the oldest Chinese book, the I Ching, is about the possible chances of life, as is the Tao. And both of those books talk about what is the key to the flow. It's sincerity. It's the rightness of the inner emotional state. It's not about trying to control and dominate the world. It's about being authentic, being true to your inner emotional state, and flowing with the world, not dominating it. In the course that we're going to do in February, we'll talk a little bit about Wolfgang Pauli. And for those of you that don't know, very famous, I believe, Nobel-winning physicist who has a phenomenon called the Pauli effect, which you can Google for yourself and find out about it, which was equipment breaking when he would come by to visit someone's lab or that kind of thing. And it's a very mysterious phenomenon. And again, you cannot explain it with causality, but it was definitely real. Jung had an experience similar in his family life where there was a knife that inexplicably snapped in 4 parts in his home. And so he says, matter can be stimulated by the inner psychic processes, understood archetypally to produce something analogous. A latent tension, for example, can manifest in creaking wood. Matter plays along with psychic processes. The archetype manifests itself in the outer world as sympatheia, as Cynthia's example was talking about from Hippocrates. There is a flow between inner states and the outer world. Another example that's very common of this is a tree striking lightning when someone dies, or a grandfather clock stops working, or seeing a sibling when they have passed away in another part of the world and in the night. So there are these manifestations in the outer world in sympathy with inner events. So we know that, something magical is going on here. When we have a synchronicity personally, we might say, well, the gods are involved, but which gods? It's not always positive. There can be these either lessons or negative things that we need to learn about ourselves. And I want to turn to talk about the way that our culture has made it very difficult for us to receive this, and we have to break through this conditioning of our culture. Jung's main point, you might say, is that there's a spiritual crisis of modern person, in that we have lost faith in the old gods and have yet to figure out what to do with that faith. We have yet to find out where we want to put that faith, and we're caught without spiritual mooring. The gods have become diseases, and we fight those diseases off with pills. So we're trying to, again, control our experience rather than look into it. Jung said that we have a materialistic bias. Synchronicity is no more baffling or mysterious than the discontinuities of physics. It is only the ingrained belief in the sovereign power of causality that creates intellectual difficulties and makes it appear unthinkable. That causeless events exist or could ever, their inexplicability is not due to the fact that the cause is unknown, but the fact that the cause is not even thinkable in intellectual terms. Our modes for understanding the world are too small for a phenomenon like synchronicity and the extended mind. Now, we used to, in our early history, very clearly our energy of, wonder and worshiping and, gratitude was focused on the feminine, focused on nature. You see this in the ancient Venuses. We clearly venerated the natural world and put the numinous, put the real experience of God into these figures. But over time, we've changed and turned away from that. And we certainly went into a period for, you could say, the last 2,000 years, as many folks do, that was a masculine dominated. We were increasingly more, the ego dominates the unconscious, we dominate nature, et cetera, leading to the science that we're, scientific age we're in now. And that has not only been positive, but negative as well. There's something that's been gained and things that have been lost. Von Franz writes in The Way of the Dream, talking about a dreamer, saying his fate will have to do with an integration of the feminine principle, which is the moon. In the past, the matriarchal world had to be overcome by the hero. Nowadays, some 4,000 years later, the situation is reversed. The dominant energy of our zeitgeist is not asking for more of the hero. It is asking for something else. So what is that else? We cannot just keep this dominance of nature model in the outer world. In the inner world, the hero is not going to do it. Cynthia told the story of Vasilisa and other tasks where nature comes along and does those tasks for the hero. This is the anti-hero. This is not the person who is out there fighting the dragon with the sword and the shield. This is the person who is participating with nature, and nature comes along and helps them out. It's a different zeitgeist and very opposite to our dominant cultural mode. So today we're deeply invested with this scientific mindset. I think that this is a narcissism. Certainly Jung felt the same way, that we are lost in ourselves, in our own creation, and enchanted with our own technology. We used to worship the goddess, then we worship the god. I believe now we worship ourselves. We worship our cell phones. God is in the cell phone. And if you watch people's behavior, you'll see that they treat technology as though it were a god, as though it were supposed to be all-knowing, have all the answers, be perfectly, functioning all the time, etc., etc. And we have a culture that thinks or imagines that it has brushed away all the cobwebs, and that all, rational science knows all and sees all. And in fact, that absolutely is not true and not the case. Jules Cashford and Anne Baring, authors of the Myth of the Goddess, encapsulate the problem this way. When this warning is not heeded, an identification of bios with Zoe takes place, the part with the whole, in which the part forgets that it is only a part, and assuming the mystery of life can be solved on its own terms, appropriates to itself the ordering of life. So I think that we are so narcissistic, so lost in ourselves, that we completely, think that we can turn the world into anything we want it to be, without understanding that we live on a finite planet. We're finite humans with finite bodies, finite time, etc., etc. So much of the world is lost under this over-masculine illness that defines our time. You see images of the future in sci-fi where it's like there's no dirt. We're getting to this clean, antiseptic view of the world, and the sort of fantasies of moving up and ascending and getting away from the muck of the planet. That is the illness of modernity expressing itself. We're not getting away from anything. And we've confused our measurement of the planet and the world with mastery. And it's a very dangerous state of affairs. One little example I'll just mention briefly is we see it with AI, right? So people say that AI is just the same as human consciousness. Absolutely not. Could not be more false. There will never be a computer or robots or whatever that are the same as a living consciousness. You cannot get there from here. There is no matter of ones and zeros that you can put together that will replace the psyche. The psyche of humans and animals is a function of a beating heart and a living organism. It is not ever going to exist in a digital form. And this is one example. The fact that we believe we could have an artificial intelligence that is greater or more than humankind is a function of this confusion of the part for the whole. We think we're the whole and we've got everything. We don't understand that we're a part only. And so we have to think about the ways that modernity makes us blind to certain things. And I think that's a couple examples. We can't see the whole. We can't just recognize that, hey, look, that's a field. That's a beautiful field right there. We will talk about Pauli and Jung more in the course. And Pauli really struggled with this himself. He understood these things intellectually, but on a feeling level, he really wrestled with it. And I think that's like a lot of us. But as Gary Sparks writes, there are moments in life when we become the object of physical events in the external world that act as a subject on us. And that is what synchronicity is about. And sometimes these events do hit us quite hard and change us. I want to tell you two synchronicity stories of mine and one other one. Really quick one. About a year ago, I was traveling to somewhere more urban from where I live, which is a little bit more in the country. And I was packing and my headlamp was in a different place than it usually is. And my intuitive voice was saying, hey, take the headlamp. And my rational brain decided, hey, we're going to a city. What are we going to need the headlamp for? Many of you might have experienced this you have a little voice says, take the umbrella. It's sunny. You don't take the umbrella. So I didn't take the headlamp. And about 8 hours later, the power went out where I was. And I certainly could have used the headlamp. That's just a little story, but you start to feel that psyche is there in some way through all of these. Gary Sparks, in his great book, At the Heart of Matter, writes, it is addressing life in the present that cleanses and heals a festering wound. Jung never tired of saying this. After the past is explored, additional inquiry into yesterday does not lead to further healing. A change of attitude in the present does. And this change of attitude is exactly the business of a synchronicity. And to exemplify this change of attitude, I present a little quick story from Michael Shermer, who is the editor of Skeptic magazine. In other words, he is the Pope of people who do not believe in things like this. And he had a very special experience at his wedding that he chose to share with folks. His wife, Jennifer, on their wedding day was feeling amiss and lonely. She wished her grandfather were there to give her away. She whispered that she wanted to say something to me alone. So we excused ourselves to the back of the house where we could hear music playing in the bedroom. We don't have a music system there, so we searched for laptops and iPhones. At that moment, Jennifer shot me a look I haven't seen since the supernatural thriller The Exorcist startled audiences. That can't be what I think it is, can it? She opened the desk drawer and pulled out her grandfather's transistor radio, out of which a romantic love song wafted. We sat in stunned silence for minutes. My grandfather is here with us, she said tearfully. I'm not alone. Shortly thereafter, we returned to our guests as the radio playing as I recounted the story. My daughter, Devon, who came out of her bedroom just before the ceremony began, I heard the music coming from your room just as you were about to start. The odd thing is that we were there getting ready just minutes before that time without the music. Later that night, we fell asleep to the sound of classical music emanating from Walter's radio. Fittingly, it stopped working the next day and has remained silent ever since. The radio had been broken and they were trying to fix it and they could never get it to work. And then all of a sudden, on the day of the wedding, out comes music and never worked again. Again, it's fitting with the grandfather clock stopping when someone passes. There are all these mysteries that go on. And if you look, you will find the heart and feeling at the center of many of them. Again, from Gary Sparks, he says, the spirit and matter issue is something we are all being called to face. The task of our time is to make life in time and space, the relationship to physical events in life, the sacred altar of being. And I think, it really does come down to the heart here. And I hope that's something you'll take away with you after this talk. I want to leave you with one last synchronicity story from me. So someone I know very closely was traveling cross country, and they had just months before been a caretaker for a family member who passed. Her uncle had passed. Sitting on the plane, all of a sudden there's a couple changing seats in front of her, and they were sitting separately, but they asked the passenger to move, and this passenger came and sat beside her. So this person and the passenger, now newly sitting beside her, start talking. It turns out they had both just finished being caregivers for people who had passed. The passenger for her father, and the person I know for her uncle. And as they talked more, they found out they were both pilots, and they had both flown in the same part of the country. And they exchanged phone numbers and, were moved, but nothing synchronistic happened. A few days later, they ran into each other downtown very synchronistically again. And the passenger said to my friend, I was going to call you. My uncle told me that my father knew your uncle. And, it was such a big deal to them and so significant after a long period of being a caregiver for someone who was passing, which is, you can imagine how difficult that is. I'm sure some of you know. So this magic, this grace, this special energy is there. We can't control it. But it does open us to a bigger view of the world. I believe a more beautiful, more satisfying view of the world. But it is different from the world we're coming from. Von Franz writes, the realization of meaning is a living experience that touches the heart just as much as the mind. An illumination characterized by great clarity as well as something ineffable. A lightning flash, a quantum leap in the psyche, it links us with the numinous, the meaning of the whole, the Tao, and puts us once again in our proper place in the whole. Okay, so I'm going to bring my friend Cynthia here in with us for our nearly last section slide. Go ahead.
Thanks, Gary. So this is an image of the pillars of creation, and I find it really evocative. This is taken by the James Webb Telescope. And I wanted to read this quote from the Tao Te Ching, because it kind of ties up this whole phenomenon of synchronicity and of deep meaning, this interconnectedness with this goddess of meaning concept. Let's see. I'm going to read it. I want you to really, really feel how this feels. This is from the Tao Te Ching. There is something formless yet complete that existed before heaven and earth. How still, how empty, dependent on nothing, unchanging, all-pervading, unfailing. One may think of it as the mother of all things under heaven. I do not know its name, but I call it meaning. If I had to give it a name, I should call it the Great. So that's all I have for now. And I think we have time for questions. Gary, did you want to add anything after that? I see you have our...
The only thing I'll say, and I have the slide up for the course for those folks that are thinking about that. I'll go back to the other slide. I would think that the other thing that only other thing that I would add is that there is a way that we're moving to a new might say level of consciousness evolution or whatever, but that is primarily by going down into the body, into the reality of life on planet Earth. That being with the heart, not throwing away our objectivity, not throwing away our rationality, but moving past its limitations into a way that we're participating both with the masculine and feminine, not missing either one. And that is the task of our time. And synchronicity is one of these great things that, punctures our over-rational bias and makes us open into something new. Yeah, that's Cynthia and I could talk about this all day, you guys. So, but we can do some Q&A. Do we want to do that now?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, we have one person with a raised hand, Mara Grace Gleason.
It's actually Sam. It's Sam, yeah.
Okay, I've been fooled by you before.
Yeah. I wanted to ask both of you, Cynthia and Gary, what is your understanding of what Jung means by meaningful coincidences? The meaningful part, has to do with feeling, or is there something more to it than that?
Okay, well, I would say, well, feeling is kind of like a guide stick to show that you're on the right track. So even doing DreamWorks, and I'll just answer in part, and then Gary, I'll hand it over to you. But when you're doing dream work, for example, and there's some weird thing in a dream, and you don't know what it is. I had an acquaintance have a dream about a snake biting her foot, and she asked me, what did that mean? And I wasn't sure. I was trying to figure out how that felt for her. And I realized that it took a while. I had to go into a kind of a reverie and not think about it cognitively. And it was my feeling that brought the answer, because I thought, now she's Catholic and not overly religious, but, that's an important part of her life. And a snake bite might be something that you could imagine happening in the Garden of Eden, for example, and just that feeling. I mean, the snake in the Garden of Eden story didn't bite Eve, but just this feeling of, the snake being there. And I realized she had learned something about someone that she could not unknow. and it changed the dynamic of their friendship, for their relationship forever. And I felt like that bite was like that bite of knowledge that had come to her. Now, to explain it like that, it's like, how did you ever come up with that association? But it was a feeling association. And when I ran it by her, she said, yes, that's it, exactly. And now it was up to her to decide whether to, what to do with the relationship. But I offer that as an example of the way that feeling can be a direction pointer, for where the meaning lies. Because the meaning, it's not like a rational meaning that we normally would ascribe. And same synchronicity. Sometimes a weird thing will happen. You like, what is the meaning of that? I don't know what the meaning of it is. But if you sit with it and feel, where does this feeling, where have I felt this feeling before? Where have I experienced this kind of a, whatever that is before? It may be in a completely different arena, but it'll be an indication of what psyche is trying to express by this thing happening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would, include both thinking and feeling, in response to a synchronicity, right? Like, you're not just going to feel, there's going to be thinking. So feeling is definitely there. But to answer your question, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I believe that meaning generally is objective. So it's happening in the world. It's clear. You can't deny it. But also, I would go back to, something like Jung's answer to Job, where he's talking about the purpose of the world that we live in, and the human task is to overcome unconsciousness, to bring light to the darkness, to figure out, even if it's our own little struggles, that minute grain of sand that gets placed on the objective scale, that typically meaning involves a situation in which you have the opportunity to become more whole. You have the opportunity to heal the divide. Something that was unconscious can now be conscious. You can be more whole, less divided inside of us. But certainly, when I look at synchronicities, as I said, feeling is a huge part there. So it's not just feeling, but I think feeling is often the part we miss. But very often, and the other thing too, the Jungian psychology is really about a change of attitude. Well, change of attitude usually means feeling, right?
Yeah.
Not always, but
Right. Yeah. All right. Thank you both. Yeah.
both.
Yeah.
Mandana Chambers.
Thank you very much to both of you for your wonderful presentation. Very fascinating. I learned a lot. And there were one central question that I have from either one of you. Ask the question, then I will make my own observation. The question is, how do you see the role of a human being's typology in experiencing synchronicity? Because I understand everything that was said about feeling and all that stuff. Absolutely no questions asked. However, I have a feeling that Cynthia may be a feeling type. Therefore, that would be a natural gateway through which your experience of synchronicity is enhanced. Whereas if somebody is an intuitive, then their intuition would be the gateway. So I think it's important for us to honor that that we are very different, as you've said, because to say it's only feeling or that is the dominant way could be a little confusing. The second thing that I wanted to say was about AI and what Gary said. If you think about what is happening around us by considering the role of the archetypes, guess who is the archetype behind artificial intelligence, communication, internet? It is the god Hermes. It is Spirit Mercurius, who, like all other archetypes, is bipolar, And we can experience his benevolent aspect through the very same internet and AI and everything else, and his destructive aspect, his thievery, his malevolent aspect also. So I think it's important that we consider that nothing happens around us without the archetypes being involved, at least from my viewpoint. Finally, I wanted to ask this question. When you talk about synchronicity from a Jungian perspective, meaningful coincidence, Jung makes it clear that synchronicities happen when an archetype is present, and that archetype has something to say. There is also the principle of fate, which Jung also talks about, the natural progression of life, inner and outer, flowing in and out like a river. I was a little confused with some of the examples if you were talking about fate or synchronicity, because synchronicity is very specific. Thank you.
Well, I'll address the first part. Gary, you can talk to the second part, and then maybe we can both answer the third part. In the first one, when we talk about feeling, first of all, I'm an intuitive primarily, and feeling second. And when we're talking about feeling function there, we're not talking about the typology. We're talking about the ability to value and to, evaluate situations. So everybody can use that capacity. And our current modern culture is more fixed, especially Western culture, because, I'm Indian. In India, it's very different. And my parents, if I try to apply Jungian typology to my parents, forget it. I cannot make head or tails. What type are they? I don't know, because the Indian type is so different. Here in the United States, I would tend to think of our culture as an ESTJ type, for example. But everybody, regardless of type, can benefit from thinking, even if that's not your predominant approach to thinking, or as through a feeling function, to evaluating something. It might be easier for some people. For example, if you are the kind of person, maybe you're more of an artist, I think this kind of valuing would come more naturally. The problem comes when you shut it down in yourself because you live in this culture and you think, oh, what's the point of thinking about it that way? There is a point. It's whole making to think that way, to think in terms of connection and relatedness. I'm forgetting if there was another point that you had made in that, but you can bring it back. But Gary, do you want to take the piece about AI?
Well, yeah, I'll take all of it. Yeah, I mean, first of all, this has nothing to do with typology. So everything I said is not relevant to typology at all. How it's relevant to typology is how we receive it or miss it or are more biased against it. So someone I know told me a story of being on a plane with someone, and they're chatting away, having a great chat. And all of a sudden, this person that she's talking to is a pilot. And and the person suddenly asks her, well, what do you do for a living? And she says, I work with dreams. And this person completely lost all interest in continuing the conversation and was like, basically, energetically said, you don't exist. I'm out. I'm done. I have no respect for you. And so that person, I mean, a typical pilot, right, is ESTJ or maybe ISTP, somewhere in there, but certainly ST. And I know lots of folks like that. And they think all inner life, all inner discussion is for losers. So this is a very real kind of person. I mean, that's a kind of person I want flying the plane. So typology makes certain facts, experiences, theories more difficult to accept or easier to accept. Now, my typology is the exact same as Cynthia's. So yeah, it's easy. We flow together. It's easy, but it doesn't change the reality of what Jung was saying about these events, or the fact that feeling is still there. It just means that it might be even more unconscious for certain folks. Yeah. So what was the AI bit? I forgot about that.
Well, the question that I asked was, I got a little confused. By the way, I'm Iranian. I'm not born here, and I'm also a Jungian analyst. So what I'm talking about is from deep experience of the material you're talking about, and I value what you said. Just kind of question the difference between synchronistic events when the archetype is constellated versus an observation and conscious experience of fate and the flow of life.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to say about fate versus synchronicity. So, I think it's kind of an archetypal thing that we have these potentials for a variety of things based on who we are, where we were born, et cetera, and you can express it archetypally with the great inflection of the archetype or the worst. So, yeah, it's not synchronicity versus fate isn't something I have much to say about. But Cynthia?
Well, fate absolutely plays a big role, because why does it strike this person this way and another person completely different? Why don't we all see the same synchronicities? We don't. They are absolutely informed by our fate, who we are supposed to be, who we came to be, what our purpose is. And the the archetype that's activated or that's behind the numinous encounter, that can be different for everybody, but it can also be, the archetype of the self, or the archetype of, whatever is happening in your life in terms of your development, your evolution as a person. The whole thing of fate, in the research that I did, the people, and I'm not an analyst, but the numerous stories that I had, it was showing them which way to go. The synchronicities that they had could be used to direct them, and they did take it that way. And my participants were not Jungian at all. They were not even I had a couple that knew about Jungian psychology, and I had one who was an analyst. And but their synchronicities absolutely directed them in fate. I have clients, and their synchronicities absolutely show us, are you on the right path for who you came to be and who you came into this world to be, or not? And if you're not on the right path, and they're not all nice, synchronicities aren't all nice. There are some pretty dark ones, some pretty harsh ones. They get you back on track. I'm not sure what the question about the archetype was, but absolutely there will be an archetype present. In this talk, I wanted to emphasize the feminine structure and not go down, all the same, highlight the main points of synchronicity that have already been made elsewhere. So, we might have missed something that you felt was critical, but all of those are there. Those are absolutely in all of the stories that we tell. Now, the stories we shared may not have the same archetypal theme throughout, like the Shermer story. Anyway, I'll continue. You had one last piece of your question.
I've taken up enough time. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mandana.
Yeah, we do have other people with their hands raised. So
Okay.
next we have Lev Krasnoselsky.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you to both of the presenters, fascinating stuff. And the question is, I don't know, maybe to Mr. Bobroff, because he's got, copy of many of his symbols, prominently in his background. In the conclusion part of the text, right, written by von Franz, she brings up a subject of evolution, right? And she's basically saying that some of the scientists, right, saying, well, if evolution is a chain of random mutations, right, and then, sort of like natural selection, if there is only that part, then the Earth as a planet is not old enough to carry out all these permutations to produce the life as we know it right now, right? So in other words, a few, billion years is not enough to just try all these combos, right? So von Franz is sort of like asking a question or proposing a thing that synchronicity, right, is actually taking place in this evolutional step, right, where it's like due to synchronistic events, those mutations are happening. So they're not exactly like random things, right? So I was just wondering, like in your research in synchronicity, maybe you came across some additional information about something on this. What would be a role, of synchronicity in evolution process? So that's basically the question. If you, happen, have any, information or opinion about that. Yes, I think Dr. Cavalli is muted.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
Sorry about that. Yes, I was muted. I'm trying to think of a cogent way to talk to this. You're right about evolutionary and the evolutionary process. In the field of complexity science, I've noticed, I don't know if you're familiar with Stuart Kauffman and his work. He's at the Santa Fe Institute, and he talks about the way in which events unfold. And in the realm of complexity science now, the different laws of thermodynamics, for example, are different for open systems versus closed systems. The ones we're used to are meant to address closed systems. In open systems, you have kind of a different set of circumstances where you not only have something like entropy happening, you have things, you can have something like consciousness that evolves. And what Stuart Kauffman was saying is it's as if we were not random. You were right, Lev. You were talking about there, statistically speaking, there's not enough time for us to have appeared. And so his point is, it's as if we were expected, and nature was preparing itself for the eventuality of our arrival as human beings on this planet. And I'm losing the thread of your question with respect to von Franz.
Oh, that was just what I was just directly quoting from the book, basically. That was, and I was wondering if you came across anything that is related to evolutionary process, and because von Franz is, in my opinion, making this fascinating thing that synchronicity is involved as a crucial step in evolution. Otherwise, you can't really explain that type of a rate at which those evolutionary processes were happening.
Okay, so I agree. I have not come across anything concrete like that, except Kauffman has been kind of thinking that way and saying, it's as if we're expected. So this idea of fate. Now, with perfect, we're in this incarnated body, and so we have limited vision. But with perfect vision, we could see the beginning and the end, prehistory, the future, everything. You could see all of that. And then you can see that there is this flow, this directionality, there's a purpose, there's a teleology that events are moving towards. There's a wholeness that can be achieved through that progression. So what Kauffman's point was that it's as if we're expected, that things are set up for us so that we can play this out. Are there specific examples? You could say that happens through synchronicity, because it's your fate that's directing it. And the archetype of wholeness, or the archetype of the self emerging and giving the, more opportunities for manifestation in the world, more opportunities to manifest themselves itself in all its different forms. You could look at it that way, but I don't know of any specific concrete example where that happens.
I would say that meaning making and the desire for wholeness has been built in from the beginning. That at the bedrock of nature is the desire for wholeness, and this is for me one of the big things you get from Answer to Job, is this idea that the whole creation is an engine for the creation of consciousness, and that's the great Edinger book about that material. For me, anytime that a scientist is using the word random, time to really look very carefully, because they're putting all the magic into, you know, oh, don't look here, we just shoved all the magic down in this hole and we're calling it random. Like, to me, I'm right there with you. I don't believe that random mutation is enough to get us where we are today. For me, my personal spirituality is that, sure, evolution is like an engine pulling us forward, but there's something, whether it's God or the unconscious or whatever, that is pulling us towards greater consciousness, and that both of these things are working together. So I don't fall into, you know, what I think is an illusion of the scientific model that everything happens because of random mutation. That's just, I mean, I feel like, you know, you can be you're being lied to when people start using words like random and putting so much magic in there. So that's my point of view.
All right, so it sounds almost as if synchronicity would be the engine of creation that way, or at least like a larger part of it.
Well, that there clearly is a desire for wholeness making. And, you know, when I really sit with Answer to Job and stuff like that, that there's a reason that we value the moral action more than the unmoral action. There's a reason that we, you know, have a thirst for justice, have a thirst for other positive values. And to me, that comes from the same thing as well, that there is this struggle that we're in, that there is, you know, the struggle that we all have to try and live our life well is an objectively valuable struggle, by which I mean the universe values it.
And also, I just want to point out that that they also, Jung and von Franz also refer to synchronicity as acts of creation and time. So there is that aspect of it that would lend itself to what you're talking about, Lev.
Fascinating, thank you. But besides, you know, actually, if you go into science direction, this ties up into what Miss Chambers was saying, you know, and the types, right? Because, you know, subatomic, you know, scientists will tell you, well, you know, if you throw observer in the mix, right, then the results of the experiments will be somewhat different, right? And that includes both the conscious and unconscious part of the observer, the whole package, you know. So yes, that's. But all right, thank you. Yeah, terrific. Yeah, great discussion.
Very interesting. Bruce Gordon. Oops. Did I send you an unmute?
I'm trying to.
There it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it occurred to me that I guess it was Gary that brought up Rupert Sheldrake's work, and the morphogenic field or morphic resonance would go a long way to describing how something that might underlie synchronicity in the human psyche could predate and could be a part of evolutionary processes and accelerate them, but also make them have that teleological quality. I wanted to observe a few things that I've heard in a lot of discussions about synchronicity that came up today, and that seem to almost obviate a definition of synchronicity by broadening it in certain ways and also narrowing it. My first, I really appreciate the description of a kind of bipolar world, and especially on Diwali, a festival in which we call back the goddess with an understanding that there's a kind of banishment underway and that she needs to be reinstated. So that was made pretty clear in the sort of review of our historic context and how Jung and the Theosophists and other figures are working in opposition to that state of being. But I think that's almost an invitation to minding the irrational and to understanding that randomness is not a kind of end in itself, but it's a higher order. And those of us who maybe began there with seeing a higher order in these chaotic processes, which is now borne out by a lot of physics. I mean, that's kind of the ground of it. But for me, to begin to study synchronicity as it arose for me without knowing what it was at the time, this was like 40 years ago, I began by creating a language for myself. And the one objection I would make to your formulation is that I don't believe feeling is paramount. I think it's a way in, but I have had so many cases where I've been able to describe to others and investigate very complicated and beautiful synchronistic patterns in their experience when they were sure that no such things were happening. So they were not using their feeling responses, their cathexis, because Freud was sort of ahead of the curve on that, a kind of cathexis to experience, which would be a kind of epiphany. They were bypassing that because, I guess, habits of mind and so on. But when you could sit them down, in other words, this is a field that exists whether we're noticing it or not. So the idea that feeling might invite synchronicity, I think, has to be made clear that feeling is a trigger for understanding and beginning to understand. But then I think what's important is to create almost a taxonomy or a kind of language for synchronicity. And then finally, the last observation I would make is that I think we need to disentangle synchronicity from PK, which is truly coincidental, because synchronicity is acausal and atemporal. So the idea of meaningful coincidence is a misnomer in itself. And so I would really strongly say that PK, which I've experienced, and many people have experienced apart from synchronicity, also telepathy and precognition, these are separate categories. And I don't want to confuse the matter, but I've come to the conclusion that synchronicity subsumes them, but they're like minor categories of what synchronicity brings into play, which is that larger fabric, a kind of nodal fabric. So the net being as wide as you need it to be will still capture anything. So thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. I would agree that that synchronicity is, as a category, subsumes all the others, and that it would be nice to have more of a taxonomy around the different kinds of phenomena. I mean, for example, if you believe that when you die, you're still alive and still have some ability to communicate, is that really, and then you get a message from beyond, is that really acausal, you know? And when we talk about acausal, we're talking about efficient cause. So it's not entirely without cause. You know, we're talking about a very specific kind of cause that you would find in everyday life. But yeah, a taxonomy would be helpful, and maybe that's something as we get more and more proficient, we'll be able to see. But the kind of feeling we're talking about is a very highly differentiated kind of feeling. It is not necessarily, I feel this way or that way about something. It's a very highly developed tool of perception that we're talking about, that has to do with the kind of a matching of, you could call it a matching of vibration if you want, a matching of emotion, a matching of the feeling tone of a situation. But thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that's thank you very much. That's beautiful.
I think probably last, unless somebody else wants to raise their hand. We have another one. So next to last, Virginia Barrett.
Well, thank you both. I really am glad you brought up the issue of feeling, because now that you mention it, almost all the synchronistic events I've experienced have been in a heightened state of feeling. So I was really glad you mentioned it. And Gary, I was really fascinated by your discussion about how physical things can be changed or moved or shattered or whatever. That part is really interesting. But it reminds me of funerals, because I found that at funerals, synchronistic things happen all over the place. And I'm wondering, there are two things. First of all, I went to one where there was a physical thing altered when there was a whole group together. So I'm wondering if you have anything about groups causing synchronistic events when everyone is highly charged, you know. Because in the case that I went to a funeral of my father-in-law, he had spent the last few months of his life sitting in front of his television and his easy chair. And when everybody gathered at the house, I was shocked when somebody came up and said his television turned on all by itself. And then a few times they turned it off and it kept coming back on. So I had to wonder if this is a group dynamic of some sort that's causing this to happen. So.
Thank you, Virginia. Yeah, I think that fits with everything that we said. And maybe Cynthia has some stories to add. I mean, I think, my story certainly echoed someone that had passed. And I have some little stories around that, but I don't have any good ones. So maybe Cynthia, you have.
Well, no, I know of stories where I think there was a group of people and they witnessed like the Virgin of Guadalupe or something like that. I mean, there have been recorded instances of group synchronicities. In this case, it feels more like the person who passed was the one turning it on, I mean, rather than and everybody's in a heightened state. Say that again.
It would seem so.
Yeah. But I mean, what a wonderful way to let you know that he was there still, or that he wasn't, it was just a different dimension of being. He's still around.
And I would add, I talked to Gary Sparks actually on Friday this week, and we were talking about psyche. And, the psyche is a mystery. We do not know what the psyche is. We talk about it, we theorize about it, we medicate it. We do not know what it is. And, from my experience, and Gary agreed with me on this, somehow, some way, it feels like there's some ancestor energy in the unconscious. And whatever that means, whatever that, what, take that how you want. But that certainly has been my experience. And it certainly feels as though what we call the unconscious sometimes seems to be populated or connected to ancestors.
Thank you.
And this is the last one, Marion Shanhart.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I just wanted to say that I think when we experience synchronicity, there's an emotional charge there. And it's like electricity or some sort of vibration that is hitting us. And we don't really, I mean, it can either be conscious or unconscious as far as the typology goes, whether it's a superior function or inferior. We all have that within us. And so I think it's easier to see immediately, oh, wow, look at this happening if it's more conscious. But if it isn't, you'll be thinking, gee, what just happened? What was that? And maybe we'll just dismiss it instead of getting the immediate connection that it did happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and
so
that happens. That happens a lot. What you're describing happens regularly. People have these experiences and walk away from them.
Exactly. Yeah. And, it could be from a thought or an event that happens, or like you say, the TV keeps turning on, whatever, or the grandfather clock keeps ringing, or whatever happens. It could be even more than one person is involved in that, and making it happen without knowing it even. And that is a very synchronistic event when all of that comes toward us. And I think also, as far as talking about feeling, sometimes we mean emotions, which of course we all have. And it depends on where it lies, how it's going to affect us in access to it, actually. And so if we are thinking emotions more with the synchronicity and leaving the feelings thought out, then people won't confuse it with typology. Anyway, that's what I have to say.
Thanks, Marion. That is a good point. When you started talking about emotions, I was thinking, oh, well, that's kind of what we were talking about.
Yes.
Called it feeling. And we don't mean the typology feeling, but
exactly.
But that can also come into play. I mean, everybody has some capacity for that kind of a thing, but you're right. Our language is so woefully inadequate to express this, and we kind of struggle and try, and we misspeak, and hopefully the spirit of our words comes through, the feeling tone, the emotion, all of it. We somehow manage to say something and get something out of it.
That's right. But thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you, Marion.
It's a lovely way to end. Thank you so much. It was really your presentation was interesting, but the discussion was even more interesting. I really enjoyed a lot of interesting things that came up during the discussion. So very worthwhile. So I hope you all have a wonderful holiday month of December, and hope to see you all back here on January 21st to talk about the I Ching appearing in people's dreams.
Yay. Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Happy holidays. Thank you.